I think I'm on. I take it back. It was all your fault. Okay, so where were we before I was so rudely interrupted? This last winter, we got a phone call one evening, and my son lives up in Virginia, Minnesota, on the Iron Range. I'm going to apologize for all the Iron Rangers right here, right now. Okay? But for the life of me, I can't understand why he lives there. I was raised on the Iron Range, and the day after high school graduation, the next morning I left town, and I have never been back. I did not fit the Iron Range. And anyway, my son and his family are up in Virginia. We got this phone call in the evening that my son's wife, our daughter-in-law, they had been out in the country. She was running in the dark and stepped in a hole and broke her foot. Now, a little bit of background. They're both self-employed. Okay? My son and his wife. And they have two young teenage children, a boy and a girl. And they had just adopted two little boys. They're not twins, they're from separate backgrounds. Two little boys that were under 2. We hung up from the conversation, and my dear wife said to me, they're going to need help. I need to go up there and help. They can't take care of these kids. She can't walk. She had to have surgery. She's in a cast. She's on one of the knee board things, scooter things. And so we packed up and we loaded up and we went north to that land far, far away. I share that with you because there is something instinctive in that. It is instinctive for a mother to care for her children and her grandchildren. It is what moms do. It is what grandmas do. It is what grandparents will do for their children and their grandchildren. They are willing to do whatever is needed. Paul says in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13, he says, through love, serve one another. Serve one another. Now, if I were to put myself in your position this morning, as a follower of Jesus, I would say, right on. Yeah, of course. Well, it's obvious. But I also know that if I put myself in many of your shoes, you don't know really what that means. We know it's the biblical answer that we are to serve one another, but we're not always sure how we go about doing that. How do I serve someone who is sitting in the same row of chairs that I'm in? How do I serve someone who's going through an illness, prolonged illness? How do I serve someone who's just gotten laid off and has lost their employment? How do I go about serving? What does that really mean in a practical sense? I want us to go to a text this morning. It's in the New Testament book of the Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 12, if you have your Bibles with you. And we're going to look together this morning at verses 11 through the first part of verse 14. 11 through 14. Let me read it for us. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it afterwards, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight paths for your feet, so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Pursue peace with all men. And we might as well just finish the verse. And the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. I think the author of Hebrews, many believe that it was the Apostle Paul that wrote the letter to the Hebrews. Whoever that author was, I think he had a grasp on the question that we ask regarding service when we say, well, how? What does it mean? How do I go about serving others within the body of Christ? Or if we take it outside of the community of faith, the faithful believers, if we take it to our neighborhood, how do we go about serving our neighbors, our co-workers at work, other students at school? If we take it out into our life and our circle of influence, how do we take this concept of serving others into practice and into reality? Paul, the author, whoever it is, gives us some practical ways that I want us to consider this morning for just a few minutes. He says, first of all, there are about three ways we can serve one another. First of all, he says, we can strengthen the weak. Strengthen the weak. Verse 12, therefore strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble. My translation uses the word hands, strengthen the hands. Some other translations use the word arms, strengthen the arms that are weak and the knees that are feeble. The whole concept means that the hands, the arms have been wearied with work and with labor. Over time, they have been overcome by constant exertion. They're worn out, exhausted, and they are without strength. The knees are feeble, and it means not just that they are weak, but they are disabled. It is almost like they are paralyzed. They have knees, but they're not functioning right. It's a bit like a paralyzed man who's paralyzed from the waist down. He finds himself on the floor. His legs just don't work. The knees are feeble. It's a picture of a life that is tired, that is exhausted. It is exhausted mentally. It is exhausted emotionally. It is perhaps despondent. It is on the verge of giving up. The issues of life have become too much for their head and their heart, and they are being overwhelmed by those things. They are crushing and pushing them perhaps towards despair. We have a picture of this in Exodus chapter 17, when the children of Israel have left Egypt and they find themselves in the wilderness. Now, let us know and understand that when we come to this passage, the children of Israel have been living in Egypt for 400 years. And for 400 years, all those generations, they had never been leaders. They had been slaves. And everything was always provided for them, their food, their clothing, their housing. And based upon that, they were required to labor for those things. So their livelihood was provided, and their lives were overruled, they were directed. They had people telling them what to do, where to go, when to go, how to do it. Now they find themselves in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, they come across an individual and his clan by the name of Amalek. Amalek and his people do not like the Jews. And they want nothing to do with the Israelites. And Amalek decides he's going to war against Israel. The Jews do not know how to make war. Do you catch this? They don't know how to make war. They have never had to make war. They haven't been trained for war. Their leaders don't know how to lead in war. But they have to face Amalek. It tells us in the short narrative of this that Moses stood up for the people. And as his people went to war, not knowing how to make war, Moses stood and raised his arms. And as he raised his arms, the Jews won. And when his arms came down, the Jews lost. And he stood all day trying to hold his arms up, from dawn to the setting of the sun. And eventually in the afternoon, he just couldn't do it. And he couldn't hold his arms up. And Amalek began to win. And Aaron and Hur came alongside him in that hour of need. They stood beside him and they propped him up and they held his arms up because they were too tired, they were too weak. Moses couldn't do it alone. They held up his arms until the victory was won. I can go back many years to when my son was born. And when my son Matt was born, he was born a little premature. He's born with lung problems. And he was a severely ill little baby boy. And the first year that we had our son, he spent more time in the hospital than he did at home. 50 years ago, doctors didn't know a whole lot about some of these lung issues. And ultimately, it took a fair number of years for us to finally figure out that the problem he had from birth was a severe form of asthma. They thought for quite some time that he had cystic fibrosis. They tried treating him for it, but all the tests that they gave him always came back negative until we finally got a definitive statement some years from the University of Minnesota. All of that is to simply say this, that in that first year, Krista and I became quite overwhelmed with this situation. Now, I was pastoring my first church. I didn't know how to pastor. I was trying to figure out what it was going to be for me to be in ministry and how to do ministry. There was just so much. And then this. And we had a young daughter at home, older sister. And I want you to know that that scenario in our life was very much like Moses trying to hold his arms up all day long. And some friends came around us. And they took our daughter and they watched after our daughter so we could be at the hospital. They befriended us, they loved on us, they stood with us, they prayed for us. Now, I want to be sure to give God all the glory and all the credit, but I want you to know that it was God that used those people to get us through. They were God's gift of grace to us in a time of real need. Just like Moses needed Aaron and Hur. When we encounter someone who is weak, we can respond to those people in a number of ways. We can respond to them by being contentious. Come on. Just get a grip. What's wrong with you? Get up on your feet. Claim your faith. What's the matter? You're a believer. Act like it. We can be contentious when we run into those people. Perhaps a little too judgmental, I don't know. I just know that that is one of our possible responses to those people when they find themselves in weakness. Another response is that of being cautious. Well, I know they need somebody, but I'm not trained. I haven't had any courses in counseling. I don't know my Bible that well. I think it would be better if I just kept my distance. I should be cautious around this right now. So we can be contentious, or we can be overly cautious, or we can respond with compassion and caring, and we can come alongside and we can be a burden bearer. A burden bearer. Isaiah 35, verses 3 and 4. Isaiah says, "Encourage the exhausted and strengthen the feeble. Say to those with anxious heart, take courage, fear not." Paul says in Romans 15:1, "Now we who are strong ought to bear the weaknesses of those without strength." Listen, when we encounter people or someone who at this point in their life is not as strong as they once were, who is dealing with some personal weakness in their life and even in their faith, we may not be able to solve their problem. We may not be able to cure their illness. We may not be able to resolve the issue or to change the circumstances in their world and in their life. But we can help shoulder the load. We can lift a part of the burden. We can help them to be adequate for the load that they're carrying. Where they are weak, we can be strong on their behalf. I want to encourage us this morning that you may encounter someone this week. And you're going to, after that encounter, that meeting, you're going to go away saying, I think they're struggling. I think they're weak in this area. I want to challenge you. God's word says, let's strengthen the weak. Would you be a burden bearer this week for someone? A second way is to straighten the way. Verse 13. And make straight paths for your feet, so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Make straight paths for your feet. This past week, let me ask you. There's a few people in here who may not really know what this is. Do you know what this is? What do we call this? A mat. For those of you under 30, this is a road map. Many of you have probably never seen one and have never looked at one. Okay, this is free. This isn't even part of the message. Dads, if you haven't taught your kids how to read a map, you better do it soon. Let me tell you why. This last week, I was supposed to have lunch with my mentor. I never had a mentor in my life until I was in my late 40s. And through circumstances, when I was at the district office, I was introduced to a gentleman, and by circumstance, by the will of God, I graduated from high school with his wife. I didn't know her, but she remembered me. And through some contacts with other people, he and I came in contact, and he asked me to join him for breakfast one morning. Now, this man can buy and sell me 100 times. Okay? He is very highly regarded and placed in the conservative part of politics in America. So highly positioned that he was anticipating the possibility of one time being asked to serve as the Secretary of Education for the administration. He became a dear friend of mine. And after that first breakfast, I called him back and I thanked him for meeting with me. And I asked him if he would be open to the idea of maybe meeting with me once a month for breakfast. And so he agreed. This prominent man agreed to meet with little lowly old me for breakfast once a month. Now, we met at his hotel in the dining room. A coat and tie was required to get in the door, okay? But we met once a month for about 5 years. Those were the best training years of my life in many ways. We never talked business. We never talked shop. We talked about his family and his kids and his grandkids. We talked about my family. Occasionally, we talked a little bit of what was going on in his life and his world and what was going on in my life at the district office and in that ministry. But mostly, we just became friends. And I listened as he talked. And after every breakfast, when I got in my car to leave, I said, I learned this about leadership today. I remember one breakfast where he had helped me with something. It's a long story, I won't go into it. But he knew that I probably thought that what had happened was going to be a problem in our relationship. And he knew that he asked me to come to that breakfast, and he knew I was thinking that he was going to drop the hammer and just let me know this is the end of our getting together. I got there first, waited at the table, and when he came in, he caught my eye, he waved, he came across the dining room to the table, and as he got close, he locked his eyes on me and he never took his vision off. He walked right up to the table, around the table, and stuck out his hand. Shook my hand, and he said, "You made the right decision." And when I left that meeting, I learned this lesson about leadership. When there is an elephant in the room, shoot it. And that was the first thing he did. He knew the elephant was in the room. And he didn't even sit down. And he shot the elephant. Anyway, long story. I was supposed to meet him for lunch on the south side of Minneapolis. I got a map out. I looked on the map. I looked up the address. I looked on the map. Oh yeah, if I take this freeway down, take Highway 100 down, and then go east on Highway 312 or 394, and it's the first exit off of Highway 100. It's just right there on the north side. I got in the car that morning and put the address in my navigator system. The navigator system brought me in from the west, not from the east. I followed it verbal by verbal. I took the turns on the right streets, going the right direction. It took me off the freeway, made a right-hand turn, made a left-hand turn, made a left-hand turn, made a right-hand turn, and took me right back out onto the freeway. And when I got on the freeway, it says, "You have arrived at your destination." My point is, if in your journeys you're putting all your faith and trust into those things, when it did that, all I had was freeway and cement walls around me. But I had looked at the map, and I had a picture in my head of where that was from where I was. And because I looked at the map, I was able to find my way down the freeway, come back around, and go the way I had figured it out in my head, where I could see it in my head. And I knew where I was going. Sometimes, part of the trial that people are in is not just being weak. Part of the trial is not just wondering what's going on in my life. I don't get it. I don't understand it. Part of the trial is not just wondering. Part of the trial is wandering in life. They're stumbling, they're struggling, they can't stay on course, they can't see where they're going, they don't know where the destination is. And the journey is just too hard, it's too difficult, it's too demanding. And it's a major struggle for them to get through this part of their life. I used to be an avid bow hunter. Not so much anymore, but when younger. I went bow hunting with my son on a farm that we had permission to hunt on, and I went in, in the afternoon and hunt until it was dark enough and the deer weren't moving, and I made my way back to the stand. I was about a mile from the truck through the woods and got up in the stand, and I sat there and the sun was going down, and I thought, you know what, I'll just sit this out until the last of light. So I sat there till the very end of light. I climbed down from the stand, reached into my backpack, and I did not have a flashlight. Now, by then, I couldn't see hardly this. There was a trail that left from my stand to a large oak tree. And I was able to stumble along that trail until I found the large oak tree. And I knew that just to the side of that oak tree, about 10 yards, there was a small trail that I took back out towards a clearing that would take me to the main trail to the truck. I made circle after circle after circle, and I could not find that trail. I'm standing at the base of that oak tree. I know where I am. But the brush and everything is so thick, I didn't want to kill myself in the dark. So I decided I'm going to spend the night at the oak tree, or I'll wait until my son comes looking for me. So I stood there for probably 20 minutes, half hour, and then off in the direction I knew I needed to go, but I just couldn't see my way through there, I saw this flashlight. And it was my son coming down a trail, and I had a beacon to home in on. And I worked my way through the brush. I never did find the trail, but I found the flashlight. Sometimes, what we need is someone to straighten the way for us. We need to be a way maker for them. Isaiah 43, verse 19. Behold, I will do something new. I will make a roadway in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Do you understand? Is that if there's a roadway in the wilderness, it's not a wilderness. And if there's a river in the desert, it's no longer a desert. Sometimes people need us to come alongside them and to straighten the way, to be a way maker. For some, at this point in their life, the way is just too hard. They're having great trouble navigating their way and making progress through whatever it is they're dealing with. And the Lord would have you and I come alongside them and maybe move some trees and clear the trail, reduce some obstacles, maybe fill some holes, maybe shine a light, a flashlight in the darkness of their life and make their journey easier. Thirdly, lastly, the third way is to support the weary. In verse 14, he says, pursue peace with all men. Pursue peace with all men. About 10 years ago, or maybe a little more now, 11 maybe, my daughter found a lump in her neck. She went to the doctor, and she was pregnant at the time, and he says, I don't think there's anything to it. let's just not do anything now. Let's wait until after you have the baby, and if it's still then, you come in and I'll just take it out. Well, that's kind of the way things played out. After she had the baby, she kind of forgot about it. And then she noticed it again. And so she just made the appointment to have it taken out. She didn't go back in for an exam. She just made the appointment. She went in, surgeon took it out. And the next day, the surgeon called her and told her over the phone that she had cancer. If you're a medical doctor here today, my advice to you is don't do business that way. Okay? I know you may deal with multitudes of them every month, but don't forget that your patients are people. So anyway, she calls us, and she is a total, complete, absolute basket case. She just had this newborn baby boy. She had 2 small girls at home. And it went through our hearts and our lives like a knife. And I must confess to you that even as a pastor, Krista and I had very dark